Let me be quite precise. It doesn't concern me a bit that a teacher, for example, wants to talk about Marxism or communism. We need to know more about Marxism and communism and socialism and all that sort of thing.
Yes, folks, Richard Nixon there. So I think something we can all agree with, that we need more communism and Marxism in our schools. I'm Matt Lech. With me on Left Reckoning 155 is David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty okay today. We had a good guest, an important topic that was ultimately depressing, but and now we have two more this evening. I'm doing okay, I think is probably what I would say. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, man. I mean,
you're in the neutral ground of a civil war right now.
Yes, sir.
In no man's land. How is it now? Bullets whizzing overhead.
You know, I had a pretty normal day. I went for a walk this morning. I got a taco. Saw some folks in town. Did some studying for tonight. Very much force fed one. You know, it's the new dangers living in Texas. There's taco trucks everywhere now. No, I mean, it's funny whenever this kind of stuff happens. People will text you from out of state and be like, is something going on? It is funny, I guess, sometimes how like the national political narrative is sometimes very out of step with like the on the ground reality for most folks. And again, I'm not saying this to trivialize anything. We're going to talk about it actually in just a minute. But yeah, I mean, people are playing with fire for sure rhetorically, but it is pretty amazing how just sort of day-to-day and regular life is.
Well, you're experiencing what New York is sort of the main pinata for, which is like, local news at 11, sort of scaremongering about how a city is being destroyed. And what it often is a sort of reactionary exploitation of a real human crisis, whether that's like a refugee crisis or, both of them actually, it's often the same thing, or like spikes in crime that are underlying like serious want in a community. That now you could, whenever I call home, it's, how is it with like all the schools overrun by refugees? And it's like, that was in Chicago, and it was because of a storm. And actually it might happen here too, but anyways, these are things that need to be dealt with. It's not a plan to replace you as a white person, though.
No, Lord help us all. Well, yeah, I mean, we'll have to dive into that in just a second. Just to let people know about our guests tonight, because we got two good ones. We have Branko Marcetic joining us in just a little bit. We've had Branko on a lot to talk about censorship, Joe Biden and the war in Ukraine, and we decided to give him a break from those topics, which sometimes people get very worked up about. And we had him join us to talk about Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina and current presidential candidate in the Republican Party. And as just a quick pitch, I know she's like not gonna pick up the nomination. I think that's very fair and easy to say. But there are a lot of people in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party who would like to see somebody like Nikki Haley and her kind of politics become ascendant within the Republican Party. So understanding her kind of political history and views of politics, I think are sort of important because, as Matt said, either live or later, one day Trump's not going to be around anymore, and there's going to be a big question as to what the Republican Party means. So understanding who these figures are, I think, is important for that.
And it's nice to let Branko do something that appeals to normie Democrats as opposed to infuriating them. That is a good
thing. And then on another topic, we have Benjamin Fong joining us. Benjamin is really prolific writer and academic, and has put together a really great podcast that is up on Jacobin Radio right now called Organize The Unorganized. It's a history of the CIO. And it's a really inspiring story. The podcast is phenomenal. A few episodes are already out. But he makes a great pitch at the beginning of that interview that if you want to think about how to organize American workers, there's probably no better time in history to look at than the time of the ascendancy of the CIO. So we talk a little bit more in depth about that, and that'll be coming up later in the program. But enough preamble, Matt. Do you want to chat a little bit about the week's events?
Yeah, I'm curious how what your take on this whole Texas mess is.
Yeah, I mean, so I have some in-depth stuff, and I think most people are familiar with the story at this point. I think it's something that is very serious. I think it's something that we need to talk about in depth. But I also think that we have to always make sure that we are operating from a realm of sanity, and also understanding that these guys are politicians, both Joe Biden and Greg Abbott, who are willing to use human beings as props for very wicked and dastardly things. But when all this talk about secession was going on last week, this was Greg Abbott at a big conference in India trying to get more investment from Indian companies into the state of Texas.
समावेशी संविधान तक शून्य के आविष्कार से डिजिटल विश्व में व्यापक छलांगे पंचांगों के खगोलीय गणित से
So, and so what was very funny for me as somebody who follows Greg Abbott on Twitter is, seeing people freaking out, seeing Greg Abbott posting very inflammatory, things of, pictures from the border, encouraging the Texas National Guard to sort of confront the Border Patrol. And then also, let me just put one more up, post like this. I'll zoom that in a little bit for y'all, posting about how great of a time he's having in India, and how similar Texas is to India, which I found very sweet. So anyways, this is not to belittle anything, but it was just sort of, a kind of reminder of, this being a very serious, high stakes, particularly for human beings, kind of political battle, but also one that Abbott is playing a PR game on and frankly is winning. Maybe we could talk about why and how then. I think most people at this point are familiar with the story. Also, if you watched the Griscom stream last week, we went really in the weeds into it. So if you want that full explainer, go and watch that video. But just really quick to remind people about who Greg Abbott is, and how he operates, and why Joe Biden has been failing, I can take you all through a quick recap, because I think that this story, more than anything, Matt, it really does show how the disorganization, the lack of political vision on the Democratic Party not only allows the right wing to win and exist, but in fact emboldens them and makes them more powerful, and makes them effective in government and out of government. Something that, is unique about these two parties is that the Republicans seem to be very effective politically when they're out of government and when they're in government, and the Democratic Party, even when it has majorities in the House and the Senate, historically, and controls the presidency, it's very, very hard for them to do politics. But anyways, there were just a lot of opportunities here for Joe Biden to stand up and do something differently than what he did, and all it did was ending up emboldening and empowering somebody like Greg Abbott. So going all the way back, Operation Lone Star is what this is all about at the end of the day. Operation Lone Star was a move by Greg Abbott to mobilize Texas's resources to the border. Let's remember that one of the initial things that he did to fund this operation was use COVID-19 money. Using COVID-19 as a justification, Greg Abbott called a state of emergency and funneled money from federal programs for his political stunts at the border, right? So already here, there is a means and a reason for the federal government to get involved. Ignore it. Then do you remember this? I feel like a lot of people forgot this. Remember when he shut down the border with Mexico? And that costs billions of dollars, not just to Texas, but to the national economy. And of course, Greg Abbott, being a governor, does not have the authority to set border policy to close borders. What he did was mobilize Texas law enforcement to harass trucks that were coming into the United States from Mexico. And what that did was create a massive logjam at the border. Greg Abbott was flying into states in northern Mexico and negotiating one-on-one. Actually, he wasn't flying in. He was making these governors fly up to Texas. Sorry, he wouldn't want to have that bad press moment. No, he was having governors from northern Mexico fly into Texas to negotiate with him. Again, the governor does not have the ability or the right to be negotiating deals with foreign powers. Already, another egregious example, one that cost Americans money, one that was a huge loser. And that was a loser because it meant that people didn't have food at HEB, almost immediately after. So he moved on from this shut down the border policy to busing. And busing has been extremely cruel. It's nasty the way that they're using human beings. But boy, has it worked. Because it didn't take too much to get mayors of Democratic cities to start saying things like the mayor of New York saying what New York can't survive these immigration policies.
Right.
Right. And the busing worked very well, sort of getting a bunch of people in Democrat-run cities to maybe start accepting a harder line on immigration.
I mean, they couldn't ask for a better, more receptive mayor than Eric Adams, crazy ass. But
in fairness,
Adams
Chicago
exactly,
to
I was just gonna
Los
say,
Angeles.
Adams is just the most extreme because of who he is. But yeah,
well, he's just like he's such an emotional guy. You know what I mean? He's just gonna, whatever's hitting him the hardest recently, he's gonna sort of fumble something around that. But the point is that worked politically for Greg Abbott. I mean, it made a lot of Democratic voters mad. It made a lot of MSNBC voters mad. Viewers mad, but it also started to push up anti-immigration sentiments within Democrat-run areas. And here's the thing about Greg Abbott is that he's always sort of operated in this gray area of the law, right? If it was at the very beginning of Operation Lone Star, using COVID-19 money to fund border operations. Is it, this busing thing that he's been doing? And now the most recent example, which has been the barbed wire, razor wire in the Rio Grande, which should always be noted, has killed people. He always loves to operate in this gray area. And I could go long and, late into the night about all the other parts of Texas government where Greg Abbott sort of operates in this gray area. But it's just one thing you have to understand about this person, this politician, is that this is where he thrives politically. And Joe Biden's strategy of basically ignoring, that doesn't work, because if you're operating in the gray area of the law and you see, hey, there's not really much when it comes to legal political consequences for me, why not keep going? And very much so, the razor wire escalation after the busing is a huge example of Greg Abbott operating in that gray area of the law. And if you could put this photograph up, Matt, just so people can see it. This park here in Eagle Pass. This is what this new conflict is mainly about, right? And if you could just scroll down so people can see the Rio Grande, and you can see behind it, and this is from the Texas Tribune, just to attribute it, but this is the park here where this conflict has sort of come to a head, where you have the Texas National Guard deploying razor wire, and they have been preventing the federal operatives in the area from doing their jobs, right? And this has created a kind of legal, ethical, political standoff between the state government of Texas and the federal government of the United States of America. The Supreme Court ruled that the Border Patrol had the right to cut down the razor wire. Remember what I said about gray areas before, y'all? They didn't really explicitly say anything to Governor Greg Abbott about deploying more razor wire. And that's basically been what he has done. And it's such a weaselly and classic Greg Abbott move here, right? Because he gets to have two things be true at once. Headlines all across the country, tweets all across the country, Greg Abbott is defying the federal government and defying the Supreme Court, while also having the safety and comfort of being able to say, if he gets challenged about it, it's like, well, actually, they didn't say anything specifically about me deploying more razor wire, right? It's, it's peevish, it's childish stuff, but this is how Greg Abbott has successfully operated in the state of Texas and is now playing on the national scale. And it creates an extremely dangerous situation. It's extremely volatile right now. We haven't even gotten to the question of like right-wing Looney Tunes. But let me just pull up this image for y'all. We have this photograph here. This is from the Texas Military Department, which is the official Twitter of the Texas National Guard, flying this over their headquarters in Austin today. And if you can't see it right here, There's the come and take it can. That's not typically there. And for people who might not be familiar, that's a symbol from the Texas Revolution, right? Very much like, emboldening a kind of attitude and behavior from the Texas National Guard. We have some video of Greg Abbott speaking. Should we go to that, Matt, or should we talk about Joe Biden's response first?
Let's stick with Abbott.
Okay, let's just stick with Abbott here because this is Joe Biden's weakness. So, all right, let me just establish this and we can get to this video. The Joe Biden strategy, I think, has been very clear. It's a failure and it's a loser of a strategy. Ignore, right? Then that failed. Then narrow opposition, because Joe Biden made a calculation early on, and a correct one in the sense of realizing what Greg Abbott wanted to do, wrong in how to stop what Greg Abbott is trying to do. Joe Biden recognized correctly, I think, at the beginning that Greg Abbott wanted to have headlines about Texas standing up against the federal government, Texas standing up against the president of the United States. Greg Abbott wanted to create a crisis at the fundamental roots of American politics, at the division between state power and federal power. That was Abbott's goal from the get-go. Biden recognized that, but instead of figuring out a way to squash a governor like Greg Abbott, he at first tried to ignore it, which only increased the ability of Greg Abbott to operate, the strategies for him to try out different things. And then he started challenging him narrowly. So he started challenging him narrowly. So initially when they challenged Greg Abbott and Texas for what they were doing in the Rio Grande, the challenge was that if you put razor wire in the Rio Grande is navigable water. And if you want to build a structure in navigable water, you first have to contact and get the approval from the Army Corps of Engineers. I mean, literally, as Greg Abbott is trying to directly challenge the authority of the federal government, Biden's legal strategy is to do permitting politics with him. That was a loser. And now we're seeing this, which, as people know, is, now Biden is trying to harden at the border. So 3 different strategies to deal with Abbott, all of them failures. And now we're getting stuff like this. So this is, Greg Abbott thrilled to be having these opportunities to appear on his favorite network, Fox News, and, smile and talk tough because of what Joe Biden has sort of allowed to fester here. But here we go.
And these people are unvetted, as I keep pointing out. And now Joe Biden's being encouraged to federalize your National Guard, your state guard. What happens if he tries that? Because he did have a deadline of Friday. He hasn't done anything, as usual. But what if that happens?
If he tries to do that...
I will just say that, it is funny to sort of be mad at Joe Biden for, not for the Republicans to be throwing digs at Joe Biden there, saying, "Oh, Joe Biden hasn't done anything yet." Well, do you want him to do something? I don't think so. Anyway,
Right.
First of all, as you know, this is the #1 issue in America. Americans want a secure border. If Joe Biden federalizes our National Guard, that would be the biggest political blunder that he could make. And that's why I think he will not do it. That said, of course, I am prepared in the event that they do make such a blunder to make sure that Texas will be able to continue to secure our border.
I'm not even going to ask you what your plan is because I don't want you to telegraph it to them.
Oh.
But the fact that you have a president that has been aiding and abetting we're now getting close to 10 million Joe Biden unvetted illegal immigrants in this country.
So vetted.
okay, so we can let it there because that's, by the way, for people who aren't in the industry, that's what you call a softball interview. You have a state governor saying that they're going to directly challenge the federal government if the federal government tries to nationalize the National Guard, federalize the National Guard, and you're just like, well, I won't ask you to tell me because I know.
See, that's the sort of thing we only ever really do for union members currently on strike. Don't tell us how exactly like how Pete Buttigieg is walking the picket line being like, so how long do you guys think you can hold out? We don't need to get super into that, but ask a follow up of what is he planning as a fucking leader of a state to do if Biden federalizes the National Guard that you're dependent on to be your Civil War strike corps.
And I'm sorry, that is 100% coordinated nonsense because Abbott didn't just bring that up for no reason. but he also didn't want to have to go on TV and say what it is that he's planning on doing. So, it puts us in a dire situation. And like, hell, we haven't even gotten to what Joe Biden's response to this has been. Joe Biden sent this out on Friday. There's been these negotiations for a while now on a agreement on immigration, very unlikely to pass. But let's... Oh,
I like that first reply there.
Is that Elon Musk?
Yeah, no laws need be passed. All that is needed is an executive order to require proof being granted an asylum hearing. That is how it used to be.
That guy is such a fucking idiot. By the way, Elon Musk is so apart from the nastiness of all the other shit that he's been getting into, and as we talked about, I think one of the most evil photographs ever is the photo of him under the bridge in Eagle Pass. He is such a moron because even if in this scenario, there would still be a massive border crisis in this situation because if you needed to require proof before granting an asylum hearing, what does that mean, Matt? That means that you need to process somebody. you might need to hold them in an area, which is pretty much exactly what the fucking crisis is about right now.
I mean, this is so much of the charlatan is and it says so much about America and the world, frankly, that he's looked at as some sort of genius. Is that what it's like? What he's doing with Twitter is he comes in and guts the whole thing, being like, "This is about freedom," and then what does he do later? Oh, all of a sudden there's algorithmic shading towards certain entities. There
or also so we make sure everyone sees Mr. Beast a bunch of times.
Right, exactly. There's moderators being hired because all of a sudden Taylor Swift AI porn is being motherfucker. That's why they were hired in the first goddamn place. It wasn't to instill a woke agenda. It was so they didn't get sued by fucking celebrities. Literally. That's why Twitter did it in the first place. So it doesn't surprise me that his solution to the problem is some sort of vague notion that is already being done. And the question is just how much resources do we devote to, say, processing people's asylum claims? Because I think we should be taxing people like you a lot more and be putting a lot more money towards this. And we can get to this is what we talked about with the Bill Clinton Gore era immigration sort of campaign era thing where Gore would hit, or Dole, sorry, say it 4-letter. Dole would hit Clinton as being soft on the border, and Border's look at all these cops and border agents I'm hiring, and what it is this, and what this feels like is a runaway train, and that's because we have a right rail and the left rail, and the left rail is willing to follow the right rail as far as it wants to bend. And that's what Biden's saying. And what's frustrating is it's funny to see the Republicans be like, oh gosh, he's giving us what we want. We want policy. Look at Joe meeting us. And it's that's not ever what it's about. It's about a campaign issue about sort of playing on different hysterias, and to just keep granting that instead of saying, actually, that National Guard is mine, and we're going to do something about these dreamers and these asylum seekers. We're actually going to good suggestion, billionaire. We need to process asylum claims. We're going to put this amount of billions towards doing that. And by the way, we're also going to pick up on what we had basically head fake toward months ago, which is AOC coming out in different Sunday shows saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't destroy Venezuela's oil economy and expect that there's no sort of hemispheric effects in terms of population flows that we might not welcome entirely. Maybe, and then that has all been swamped because there's not any follow through. And that's really the Joe Biden first term experience is you get a jab step towards the right thing, and then you'll get just back on the train tracks. And it's going to all crash.
No, I think it will. And, I think most people have seen this at this point, but, Joe Biden's response to this very blatant attempt from the Abbott government here in Texas, for the federal government, is to say, what has been negotiated would, if passed into law, be the toughest and fairest set of reforms to secure the border we've ever had in our country. It would give me, as president, a new emergency authority to shut down the border when it becomes overwhelmed. And if given that authority, I would use that the day I signed the bill into law. The response here, as Matt just sort of perfectly laid out, is the left, the so-called left, Joe Biden, the Democratic Party. Hey, yeah, we're going to fall around the right wing. And the consequences for everyday people are massive. All that this does, it's a loser because, as we all know, that immigration bill is not getting passed, right? Not that we even would want to get passed, but it's not getting passed. So it's a loser. And all that we're doing now is sort of granting the premise that actually, the problem with the Republican Party and the Trump movement is not all the nasty ass shit that they say about the border, not all the horrible things that they want to do to people seeking asylum, right? That's not the problem. The problem is they're not good at it like us smart Democrats are. Very classic example of how the Democratic Party operates in politics.
And ultimately, in the context of what we're going to hear ad nauseum over the next months, is we got to fight fascism. And meanwhile, Joe Biden saying, hey, give me the power. I'll shut down the border now, motherfuckers. And yeah, what do you think Trump will do with any sort of expanded executive authority? Of course. Not that there's actually that much difference. I think Biden has up processing to a non-substantial degree, but we still have Title 42, and we still have maybe not the degree of family separation that we saw under Trump, but we still see families absolutely under horrible circumstances because we don't actually want to deal with this, and we would like to punt. Biden wants to punt desperately on all these issues so we can get back to arming genocide.
Totally. And, again, and the plan that is being put forward by Joe Biden, by the way, let's be very clear, is about basically holding people on the Mexico side of the border, which is another humanitarian disaster in and of itself. It's not any kind of solution to this. The Democratic Party has shown for a long time. Look, the Republican Party is nasty, and they make the situation way worse because they kick the can down the road. They don't want to play ball. They don't want to negotiate. But the Democratic Party is completely afraid of doing politics. Immigration has been just a winning issue for the Republican Party for almost my entire life now. The Republicans have never come up with any kind of significant way to deal with it. Again, because the intention is just to hold up something that's abstract and vague and trying to freak people out about migrants. But the Democratic Party has never been able to go to the people and speak politics about what this means and what a different plan, what a humane version of our system would look like. The Republicans are going to stop you. The Republicans are going to fight, and they're going to kick, and they're going to scream. That's goddamn politics. From healthcare to war to taxing rich people to immigration, the Republicans are going to fight you. In God's green earth are we talking about here? That the Republicans are going to fight us if we try to do something. So no, you have to find ways to beat them. And there's no strategy here. The strategy here, every single move was a blunder, right? Not addressing the situation from the get-go when Abbott started doing these theatrics, right? Then trying to do a narrow technical defeat of Abbott. Oh boy, that ain't going to work. And now the new strategy is, again, not even a direct confrontation with Abbott as they get bolder and bolder and bolder, but actually, hey, we're just going to do our own nasty right-wing immigration strategy and see if maybe that will work. Every single moment here is a complete blunder, and it just creates more and more opportunities for people like Greg Abbott. We don't have time to, but it also creates opportunities for little freaks and bigots and unhinged antisocial freaks who see these things when Donald Trump or Greg Abbott says this country is being invaded as a call. That's an extremely dangerous thing to let fester and continue because you're too cowardly to build any kind of political opposition to the right. But I think that's going to have to be it for now. We're going to be covering this more, obviously, because it's not over yet. It's a dangerous, dangerous world here when the two political options are people like Donald Trump who want to do brutality and people like Joe Biden who want to do brutality, but in a different way.
Yeah, like an ice cream cone.
But folks, should we talk about, should we bring on Branko here for this conversation? Really looking forward to sharing this one with you. Branko, I will just say before we bring this on, if y'all aren't reading Branko's pieces in Jacobin, you really should. This is somebody who, whenever I see that byline, it's an instant click for me, whether it's in Jacobin or in the many other places that he's been published. It's always a pleasure speaking with him, and really happy to share this conversation on Nikki Haley in South Carolina with y'all.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Lech. With me is David Griscom. Hello, David.
What's up, brother?
And joining us now, Branko Marcetic, staff writer, Jacobin, and regular guest of this program, here to talk about Nikki Haley, still presidential guest. I'll say that with the uplift at the end, just in case, she decides to save face a little bit. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with me today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited to talk with you a little bit about Nikki Haley because, look, we all saw the results in New Hampshire. I think all the hope from certain segments of the kind of commentariat that Nikki Haley was going to be able to get one over on Donald Trump. I think that's been proven wrong. But I do think that Nikki Haley is sort of trying to set herself up to maybe be the inheritor of the Republican Party, or at least making a pitch for herself, because as Matt said the other night on the program, it's like one day Donald is going to go away, either from politics or from the planet, and there is going to be a question of who's going to sort of run the Republican Party. So looking at her trajectory, what she represents, I think is important. Because there is this kind of pitch and I think desire from certain folks to sort of treat Nikki Haley as a sane Republican, right? The good old days when Republicans were normal. And your piece in Jacobin is a really good recap of why that is, so off base. I mean, before we get into her, I am curious, if you have any comments on that kind of, particularly from the liberal MSNBC type, out there who are sort of, wanting to see a Nikki Haley be successful right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the perennial search for the, sensible, sane, never Trump Republican. And I mean, what and I think you guys, many people have been putting out for a long time is that brand of republicanism isn't really contrary to Donald Trump. It's actually the thing that led up to Donald Trump. There's a reason why there's not that much daylight between someone like Haley and Trump, because Trump is the inheritor and he's a logical kind of conclusion, endpoint of all the trends that we saw under all these people that in the Trump years have been kind of eulogized as kind of the, a forgotten golden age of conservatism, George H.W. Bush or, Bob Dole, or, you could go down the list. So, I think as long as Trump is around and he's a political contender, we are never going to, sadly, be free of this kind of ridiculous, futile hunt for this kind of non-Trump, decent Republican.
Yeah, and I also think that it's worth noting too that at least when it was a crowded field, what Nikki Haley was sort of trying to use to set herself apart from the rest of the GOP field is that she's more hawkish and more of a warmonger than the rest of the GOP, right? So I don't know what your definition of sanity is, but
and she wants to cut Medicare and Social Security, raise her retirement age. So she's actually, I mean, obviously Trump wants to cut all those things. That's what he did. He tried to do when he was president, but he doesn't talk about that anymore because I think he realized that that's politically toxic. So she's actually to his right on those issues. At least like in terms of his self-presentation.
Yeah, I mean, this is a common misconception that I think is driven by the sort of elite. Trump is not ideologically more extreme. He is simply more popular than Republicans. That's why he's a problem, because he can get into office where Jeb Bush or Ron DeSantis, Americans see them and are like, what? Get out of here. And so there's this common thing, Trump is he's so extreme. He's extremely good at getting people to come along with him. But as far as what things he runs on, it's all over the place. But and sometimes it's very extreme, like there needs to be some kind of punishment around women, but other times it's we can't leave people on the street without health insurance. And Nikki Haley is a good example of that, because she's like saying, we need to was she to finish the job, let Bibi finish the job in Israel or whatever. Maybe that was Ron DeSantis, but either way, like extreme bloodlust when it comes to like positioning in these sorts of issues in a way that, like, look, I don't think Trump is going to really flank Biden on Palestine in any real way, but like Nikki Haley is definitely going to try to flank him to the right.
Yeah, I mean, she came out for basically full-throatedly advocating just scattering Palestinians to the ends of the earth, which obviously is the Netanyahu government's position, but the Biden administration has been very careful to take the moderate line of supporting the mass murder of Palestinians, but not going as far as saying they should be completely banished from their own land. And I mean, also when she was governor, I mean, she was very against the Syrian refugees being resettled in South Carolina, which is a step away. I mean, I would say it's a degree or two away from Trump's Muslim ban in terms of basically the kind of bare racism that kind of underlies it. And then, of course, in that same year, she later condemned Trump for saying he was going to ban Muslims from coming in. Which is a very good illustration of kind of the way that she's been able to function in the U.S. political landscape.
Well, and I think this is something that will be interesting as we now take a little bit of a deeper dive into her political history, is that race and racism, the way that she relates and talks about that changes dramatically throughout her career, and not even just in let's say a linear way. It is a little up and down. But let's look at this piece here that you wrote. Just going to put it up on screen again for folks to check it. And again, it will be in the show notes as well. The long disastrous career of Nikki Haley. Maybe before we get into some of the things that she got into as governor, Branko, could you introduce Nikki Haley's kind of early life and early political career to folks who might not be as familiar with it?
Yeah, sure. She's kind of like the right's Obama. At least that's certainly how people on the right were hoping that she would kind of eventuate. She's an immigrant. She's the daughter of small business owners. She herself worked in the family business. She kind of put forward a right-wing version of Obama's kind of post-racial, the liberal post-racial narrative put forward by Obama, where, hers was, I would say, more crude. So it was just basically, look, yeah, sure, we had some problem with racism, but ultimately, America is not really a racist country, and we moved past that. And I mean, you saw that recently. She's made similar comments to that, I think, in advance of the Iowa caucuses. And as you say, she has kind of throughout her career used, let's say, identity politics. She's kind of picked and chosen when to deploy it. When she ran initially, she said, I'm not. People said, you're Indian, you're Sikh. How do you feel about being, representing those communities? She said, I'm not a spokesperson for anyone. That's not what I'm running for. That's not who I am. But, she was not remotely hesitant to deploy her identity in certain situations, to say that, either to say that South Carolina and the South had changed. It used to be racist. It wasn't anymore. She did that, after the Charleston shooting. She said, look, we've solved the racism problem. We don't have to put down a Confederate flag. Actually, we already solved the problem because I was elected, essentially, which kind of is a weird dark mirror version of the and a less subtle one that Obama put forward to America as well. And she's also been, as we've seen throughout these debates, and we've seen time as governor, she very much leverages her gender, as a kind of weapon in a way that Hillary Clinton, used to as well. But, and I'm sure, Haley would normally kind of find that, criticize it or something, but she's used the same kind of rhetorical tools. Anyway, so that's that part of it. She at one point in the early 2000s, I think 2004, she ran for state legislator. She won. She actually beat, I think, the longest serving state legislator in the state's history. So that was kind of an early key of a clue of how talented she was as a politician, because I do think she is quite good at the politics thing. And she, after 6 years or so, where she kind of presented herself as a champion of ethics and good government, someone who, she pushed for on-the-record voting, which South Carolina didn't have. If lawmakers voted on something, you never knew whether they had voted for or against because it was all by voice. She said, no, we have to get this down. We have to put this on record because it's about ethics. She parlayed that into a run for governor, and then she won. Fairly unexpectedly. She beat a bunch of far more established Republicans, and then she ended up beating the Democrat, a conservative Democrat who actually got the Chamber of Commerce's endorsement in that race. So I think, she's a fairly, for all the terrible things we can say about her, and there are many terrible things we can say about her, she's a fairly talented politician, and I think she's a bit of a survivor. She's kind of somehow managed to stay in the game for a very long time.
Well, and I think that's one thing that's really notable about Nikki Haley. Is, as you said, it's like she's sort of lived through a few different kind of generations of like American politics, I think distinct ones. And, we have to share this just because it's so good, which is, she takes on over after Mark Sanford, who was disgraced in the state of South Carolina after a very, very public cheating scandal was discovered. And I will just play this this clip from the time.
I found in this job is that one desperately needs a break from the bubble.
A stunner from South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford. After nearly a week-long disappearance, the Republican dropped this bombshell.
I've been unfaithful to my wife. I developed a relationship.
Look at the lady behind him.
It started as a dear friend from Argentina.
Why is that relevant? Okay.
It began very innocently, as I suspect many of these things do.
State leaders began asking questions Monday about the governor's whereabouts. He hadn't been at work since Thursday. His aide said he was hiking the Appalachian Trail. At Atlanta's airport Wednesday morning, Sanford admitted he'd just returned from Argentina.
Recently, over this last year, it developed into something much more than that.
At a news conference Wednesday.
So anyway, just had to throw that in there because that is a very old school and classic political scandal. But I mean, for real though, this is the Nikki Haley was able to sort of inherit the Republican Party from Sanford, who was, I guess what I'm saying is Nikki Haley becomes a major player in the Republican Party in South Carolina. And she was able to really take over that party because of this disgraced figure who probably was going to be a major player for a long time. So there's a bit of a power vacuum, and her ability to beat Vincent Shaheen really set her up to becoming an extremely influential and powerful politician in the state of South Carolina. Now, how was she as the governor of the state of South Carolina, Branko?
Not good. You'll be shocked to know. I mean, she won in 2010. It was the kind of height of Tea Party mania, and so that was a very different. Some would say not that different. I think there were important differences between kind of the Trump era of the GOP and that era. I mean, that was all the rage was. More and more tax cuts, slashing spending, as well as a kind of socially conservative agenda, and really going hard on those things. Obviously, the GOP still does that, but there is actually a kind of a countervailing force on the right that kind of at least pushes back against that now. Not really so much in South Carolina in 2010s. There's so much I could say, and I've written a 9,000 word long piece about it. But I mean, basically, she doubled down on everything that had caused the crisis that South Carolina was in. The state, because of Sanford and others' tax cuts, just a slew of irresponsible tax cuts over years. Number one, had a shortfall in revenue, but then number two, when the recession happened and, a lot more people who were struggling suddenly had to rely on government services to be able to, put a roof over their heads, or feed their kids, or, just survive. That ended up kind of ballooning costs. And so you get this budget crisis when she comes in, and her approach to tackling that was, well, I'm going to cut taxes even further, and I'm also going to slash spending on core services, particularly the state's health department, basically, because that had, I think, the biggest shortfalls at $200 million or so. And it was a hard time for a lot of people because of that. I mean, at the same time she did this, so she kind of condemned basically everything that we would consider kind of a core part of society, and a core part of what a government does to create a functional society. So schools, healthcare, social services, all that stuff. As she was coming that, she was also just doling out unheard of amounts to businesses to bring them into the state, just handing out tax incentives and all kinds of things as a way to create jobs. Now, probably the most famous one of that is Boeing, which coincidentally she later landed on the board of. And I think Sanford had already given Boeing something like $900 million in tax incentives, which is insane. Remember, we're talking about the budget shortfall was something like $800 million when Haley came in. Haley gave them, 100 and something more million dollars, 120 or so million dollars. And that wasn't the only one. I mean, there were just terrible deals galore. One of the ones I highlight in the piece was this Volvo deal where she actually went around the state legislature and she let us say, well, this is what the company wanted us to do, so I just did whatever they asked. Sign up for it's called a balloon payment. You don't pay the principal. You only pay interest for the first 6 years, and in the 7th year of the loan, you pay the principal, which would have added $87 million to the loan. It was a horrible deal, terrible deal. Not someone that with an accounting degree and with a history as a business person really should have done. But this is the kind of thing that she did. It's a classic kind of plutocratic agenda. You condemn everyone else to just harsh austerity, and then you lavish people who are already rich and powerful and doing well with endless amounts of favors. That sums it up, really.
And I think these are like really important things, again, for somebody who's running for president, somebody who wants to have more influence in the Republican Party. Matt, I don't know if you have that Boeing clip handy, but I mean, this is somebody who's very much like a company woman. And yeah, there's no surprise when you watch this clip. If you had any doubts, there's no doubt. There should be no doubt in your head why this person ended up being on Boeing's board after they were governor. This is her talking, because when Boeing is expanding in South Carolina, there was a big union fight in Seattle, Washington, I believe, Washington State at least, against the expansion in South Carolina, which was right to work state, non-union plant. And the NLRB starts trying to get involved in it. And this is Nikki Haley talking about that on Fox and Friends.
No, it's a checks and balances guideline, because this is nothing more than bullying.
Just slow that down.
Yeah, please, friend. So this is just to set this up. This clip is the hosts are asking her. Harry Reid said something along the lines of, "In our government, we have checks and balances, and this is why you need an organization like the NLRB to make sure that certain groups don't abuse others." And this is her response to that.
Oh, if this is checks and balances, God help country, because this is nothing more than bullying by the labor unions. This is Harry Reid and President Obama carrying their water, and making sure that our companies are hurting because of it. All they're doing is getting the friendliness of other countries who are going to take our jobs. This is a terrible thing for South Carolina. It's terrible for our country, but I will tell you, while this happened in South Carolina, I won't let this happen to any other governor in any other state. We have to be able to allow our companies to create jobs wherever they want to. That's a great thing. And we are very grateful for Boeing in South Carolina. What the president needs to do is ask the NLRB to step down. This is the union's last attempt to be relevant, and it's not working.
But, just think about this.
I mean,
California, I'm sure, is upset how.
And anyways, I mean, like that's who this person is. I mean, could you tell the difference between her and like a Boeing spokesperson? I mean, this is the governor of a state going out there and basically doing pro big business propaganda on TV.
Yeah, she said at one point about this Boeing kerfuffle, if you go after a corporate citizen, that's personal to me. She at times, I mean, there was an instance I highlighted in the piece where she was at this aerospace show that Boeing kind of headlined, and she's there and she's saying, the reason why aerospace industry is doing so well is because of Boeing. I mean, it really was like she was a Boeing spokesperson moonlighting as a governor of a southern state, and then of course it's a natural fit that they eventually did just give her an actual job at the company.
Yeah, and I don't think most of our listeners, need the breakdown of the economic history. But while she was governor, and this is somebody who basically oversaw a big portion of this expansion of industry in the South, fleeing unionized workforces in the North or in the Pacific Northwest to come to the South, not because they liked the weather or the people or the food, but because they thought that they could pay people less for the work and they wouldn't be protected. And they would, in fact, you would have a governor going out and doing commercials for you on TV. So in addition to like the bad governance and the abuse of the kind of public purse and treasury that you saw under her governorship, it is just a massive expansion of corporate power in the state of South Carolina. Which again, if you look at the rankings, is a state that, is oftentimes towards the bottom in terms of education, high rates of poverty. South Carolina is like one of the more unequal states in the country. And that goes, there's a historical reason for that, but that's a place that has crippling poverty. And this is somebody who expanded that, for the benefit of corporate persons, as she would like to call it.
Yeah. I mean, the unionization rate fell under her and she was very glad about it. I mean, she celebrated that fact. For her, that was a fundamental part of South Carolina's appeal to businesses, and that was part of an economic pitch that will create jobs basically by just creating a race to the bottom, by winning the race to the bottom, by making it so that companies can come to South Carolina and just freely exploit and treat people as terribly as possible, but they'll have jobs out of it. I would be remiss not to mention the fact that a lot of these companies that she was, throwing money at were donors to her, both before and after, which is that's another one of the kind of recurring patterns in her entire career, back when she was a state legislator too, that she, by sheer coincidence would constantly end up doing favors for companies that gave to her campaign fund or to her leadership PAC or to one of her, I think, 2 or 3 political organizations that she set up, or they would give her gifts personally, travel, accommodation, jewelry, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of pay-to-play stuff going on there as well, alongside the kind of, ideological commitment to just basically giving corporations a free run in South Carolina. There was, I think, also a personal benefit to her out of that.
I think undoubtedly, and like one thing that I think you lay out really well in your piece is just how early that started, right? So when she was in the state legislature, she started doing a lot of work to sort of help out payday lenders. And I think that if the numbers, if they're coming to my head correctly, in the piece, the thing that's always funny when you see this kind of corruption for politicians is like how much it takes to move them. The payday lender, money was not like that much, but still you can see a line here. And then once she becomes the governor, I mean, you wrote in your piece, like she would never have any issues fundraising again. So yeah, I think that like, in addition, I think to like having a bad political ideology, this is somebody who's very, pay to play. And like, I think one example that really highlights this is, a fight that happened between South Carolina and Georgia, with the dredging of a river. And, she was basically taking Georgia company's side over South Carolinians. And even the Republican Party in South Carolina was like, what the hell are you doing? And as you know in your piece, well, it looks like there was some money, that might have been playing an influence to some level there.
Yeah. Like 2 weeks before she did that, she had done a fundraiser in Georgia and I think raised $15,000 or so. Which again, not that much money, as you say. But anyway, so she raised that 15 grand. She raised it at the party of this very influential Georgia Republican operative who also happened to be, I think, on the finance committee of the Republican Governors Association. And the Republican Governors Association had kind of helped to put her over the line in the election and against Vincent Shaheen in 2010 because they put this $900,000 cash infusion of ads to help her. And by the way, some of that money came from a bunch of tobacco companies. Haley had earlier voted against restrictions on smoking, so for the tobacco industry. Anyway, so she does this fundraiser at this Republican Governors Association linked person who also happens to be linked to the Georgia governor. Then the Georgia governor, the sort of environmental board in South Carolina says, no, we're not going to give a permit to Georgia to dredge this river because of environmental concerns. The Georgia governor goes to her personally and he says, hey, could we get another hearing? Could you do something about this? She calls him up and says, hey, why don't you have another look at this? And then the DHEC, the environmental department, they mysteriously change their mind and decide to give the permit anyway. And the state legislature, which was controlled by Republicans, actually had to vote it down. And this is another theme throughout her career, is that even though she herself was a Republican, even though Republicans were pretty much in the driver's seat the entire time she was governor, they had a lot of feuds with her. And often found her, more extreme than they were, or just kind of baffling, fiscally irresponsible, making decisions like that. I think one person I quote in the piece says, why is the governor the only person in South Carolina who seems to want to carry water, in this case literally, for Georgia instead of for the state?
No, it really is something else. And again, I think this is why somebody like that is like a dangerous figure in politics, both within the Republican Party and, Lord help us all, in the presidency. I wanted to sort of pivot just a little bit, to like the question of like race and racism, because it is something that I think is really notable. If you start digging into her history, I mean, people know obviously she recently wasn't able to say that the Civil War was about slavery, And, that's a constant theme in her kind of political life. I think we have this video right here, Matt, of her talking about the Confederate flag after Dylann Roof. And just the way, and she's very famous for one thing when it comes to Confederate flags. She took the Confederate flag off of the State House grounds, right? It had been flying up there forever. And she ended up taking it down, and putting it, quote, in a museum, where it belongs, her words. But even after doing that, listen to how she still has to talk about the flag.
I knew it was going to be harsh. I knew it was going to be brutal, and I knew that people weren't going to understand where I was coming from. But when that murderer held up that Confederate flag, he hijacked it from me, and he turned it into a hate symbol. And we could not have a hate symbol on the grounds of the State House. And so we asked for the removal of the flag. And from there, we had a debate. I asked the legislature to come back for that special reason, just to take that vote so that we didn't wait until January. It was in June at that time. And, the legislature moved forward. And now that Confederate flag is in a museum where it belongs.
Do you think that was an act of healing, as it turned out?
I hope so. I hope that it was. I think for me it was. And I hope that for the families it was. But I think it also was.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Such stupid logic. If the bad guy hijacked something, you shouldn't give in to his logic.
I'm sorry. I just I know I'm saying the obvious, but the idea that Dylann Roof is the one who hijacked the Confederate flag, and look, and this is an excuse or an apologetics or anything like that. South Carolina has an extremely complicated relationship with the Confederacy for obvious reasons, and the political climate there is way more rabid about the flag than it is in other places. But Lord help us all. I mean, at this point, you've taken the flag down. You can at least be able to say something more than that.
Well, Well, it's interesting watching her. I've not seen that clip before. It's interesting watching her try and split the difference, where she goes, well, what happened was he transformed it into a hate symbol. It was fine before, but it's because he did this thing and then he held up the flag and he had those pictures with himself with the flag. That's why it became offensive, and that's why we had to get rid of it. So it's her actually trying to retcon her position. I don't know when this was, 2019 or something, but yes, whatever, some years earlier, because obviously she knows in the kind of post-Trump Republican Party, she doesn't want to appear to, whatever woke or whatever word you want to use. So now she has to kind of find some other way to still seem principled and still get the liberal points for having taken down the flag, but not piss off Trump voting Republicans. So it's kind of interesting to watch her kind of try and do that in real time.
Well, it's truly fascinating, especially when you watch the big man himself responding to this. I don't know if you've all seen this, but it's pretty good.
I'm glad you guys.
They asked her how did it start? She didn't use the word slavery, which was interesting. I don't know that it's going to have an impact, but I'd say slavery is sort of the obvious answer. It's supposed to about 3 paragraphs of bullshit. She just talked. Nobody knew what she was saying. Haley recently said Iowa voters will need to be corrected by other states. Now, I don't know if that's, I don't know. But it doesn't seem nice, right? Today in New Hampshire, she...
Sorry, that's a little bonus Trump for you. It's just one of the best at the free form, I gotta say. But, again, it's obviously way easier for Donald Trump, who just is absolutely beloved in the state of South Carolina. We should also mention, to talk about this thing versus Haley. But it's at this point, if Donald Trump is running circles around you for you not being able to condemn the Confederacy enough, the boat has sort of sailed now, Nikki.
Well, this is the kind of the issue they all had, which is that they were all trying to be him in different ways, or at least try to operate in a way where they wouldn't be kind of pickings for him to criticize. And so they all felt, okay, well, Trump says all this outrageous stuff, he plays to racism and misogyny and all this stuff. So we have to kind of try to appease those voters. And they would say something ridiculous like Haley did, where she doesn't want to say that slavery causes civil war. And Trump, because he can do whatever he wants, he owns this party, just then hits her from the left, which is, a classic move that he loves doing. And it was a similar thing, DeSantis as well. He put out an ad that tried to kind of go to Trump's right on LGBTQ issues, where he basically tried to make Trump seem like to use their kind of parlance, woke groomer or something, because they use this interview he put out, after the the Orlando Pulse shooting in 2016, where he said, of course we're going to do everything to protect our LGBTQ people, yada, yada, yada. And he used that to kind of say oh yeah, this guy, he's in favor of the gay agenda. I'm the one who's really going to trample all over the rights of gay people. So it's funny, and that got him actually in hot water. Long time Republicans criticized DeSantis for the ad. They were like, this is really homophobic and awful. And I don't think it clearly didn't do anything for DeSantis' chances. So it's interesting, they people like Haley and DeSantis and everyone else is kind of in this trap where they don't want to out-Trump Trump, but then they kind of feel like they have to play to what they think is his base. But then Trump doesn't have to play by any of those rules, and he just will use anything to make them look like idiots. It's interesting to watch.
It certainly is, and I wonder how it's going to play out, particularly in media, as Matt and I are frequently do. We sort of like to peek in on our favorite, weird right wing YouTube guys, and a lot of those guys have also had a really hard time, I think, with Trump in this cycle. Because a lot of them were sort of actually hoping for, not so much for Haley, because she's not as epic and based, even though she defends the Confederacy to some extent still. They all wanted DeSantis and Ramaswamy. But even they are sort of out of step with Trump at times, which I think is, has been interesting to watch. Like Dave Rubin recently, furious about things that Trump was saying. So it's not just members of the Republican Party, I guess is what I'm saying. It's the entire right wing ecosystem. And I think the big lesson is it's just like Trump just runs this thing and no one even knows.
Yeah.
No one can even follow him properly, right? You have to wait for instructions at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when he said the thing about the Iraq War and Bush in that debate. And I mean, that was one of the early moments where I remember people going, "Oh, he's dead, he's finished." But no, you can't say that in a Republican debate and get away with it. And it turned out, no, you can very easily. So he's constantly rewriting those rules.
Yeah.
I should add, I mean, the Confederate flag thing, by the way, that this is a key part of her branding. It's probably what helped her kind of ascend from the South Carolina governorship, because she might have been stuck there and then had like a very unproductive last 2 years.
I mean, it's a small state, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and she.
I'm just saying, like, no, you're right. I'm just saying, like, it's not like South Carolina is not necessarily like a stepping stone to national politics for most people.
No, definitely not. And part of why she was saved was because of that removal of the Confederate flag. She was able to kind of rebrand herself while Trump was simultaneously running. I'm the more tolerant, inclusive, kind of moderate part of the Republican Party. I'm the kind of decent heart of the GOP compared to this clown over here. But the reality is, that was completely opportunistic. And despite what she made it appear in that clip that we just watched before, she dragged her feet after the shooting. She said, you know what? People asked her, is it time to get rid of the Confederate flag? And she said, you know what? This is not the time for that conversation. That conversation will come later. We need to just simmer down, and we need to talk about healing and that kind of thing. And she had earlier, Vincent Shaheen, when he ran against her second time, had called for the removal of the Confederate flag. Her campaign manager called it desperate. She made some lame response like, you know what, I've talked to a bunch of CEOs in this state and no one's ever brought up the Confederate flag to me. So the thing that seemed to have pushed her to actually do it, number one, there was a lot of protests. There was a lot of calls from all sorts of groups. There were even Republicans who came out before her and said maybe it's time to remove this from the state capitol. But ultimately, there was the threat of out-of-state protesters. People getting very, as you can imagine, riled up in the wake of this horrible atrocity. And that was kind of the thing that finally led her to push her over the line to go, okay, I'm going to come out for this. I mean, it was a very canny, clever move on her part, but it wasn't remotely sincere or genuine. And by the way, she also at one point in her re-election campaign nominated or appointed as a co-chair of the campaign someone from the Conservative Citizens Council, which is a racist hate group that Dylan Roof, the guy who had shot those churchgoers, had cited in his manifesto as an influence on his thinking. So that that shows you how. Haley, like many of these moderate Republicans, it's all about presentation. It's not really about any kind of policy or concrete beliefs.
100%. And we have to ask you, do you think she has any chance in her home state against Donald Trump?
Probably not. I mean, based on what I've seen so far, it doesn't look great. The entire South Carolina congressional delegation seems to have gone for Trump. The governor, who was her deputy, he's gone for Trump. So I don't think so. I would not rule out her, despite all the mud they've been flinging at each other, I would not rule out her being picked for running mate, which in some ways, if we're just talking about the politics of it, actually could be kind of smart on Trump's part. But I've ceased to make predictions. If I was to bet, I'll make a friendly, fun bet on that. But I don't know, what's going to happen.
You could go ahead, David.
Oh no, I was just going to play this last Trump thing. So you go first.
I was going to say, do you have any observations on the American electorate based on the how she performs against Biden in a head-to-head that she's never going to actually be able to run? because she does crush Biden in a way that Trump doesn't. And, it's something like maybe we'll have to confront in the future.
Totally. I mean, in many ways, I think the winner of these last two primary contests has really been Biden, because the entire strategy, the entire re-election strategy of the Biden White House, the Biden team, is for Trump to run. And so they're getting what they want. And that, to be honest, that probably is the best thing they've got, because they don't seem to want to run anything. They just want to point out how scary Trump is. It's a lot harder to do with Haley, who I think, if you drill down to the details, Haley is terrible and has a horrible record of mismanagement and cruelty and all sorts of things. But, and this is not a uniquely American thing, the reality is some people do look at those details. A lot of people don't, because politics is something that just happens in the backgrounds of their lives. And so for them, they would just see, oh, she seems very crisp. She seems very nice, very well dressed. She doesn't say anything crazy. She's not under indictment. And so, maybe she knows what she's doing. And I mean, she could probably point to the fact that South Carolina did have an improvement in the economy, a pretty major one. There were a bunch of jobs that were created in the state. So she could make that pitch. I think it's probably for the best for the Biden campaign team that she is not probably going to be the nominee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we'll be watching very closely to see what ends up happening. I don't know if we will see her on the stage in Trump's kind of rogues gallery, unless she gets. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if she ends up being one of these guys or being next to him on the ticket. I don't know if y'all have seen this. This is Tim Scott, who we did not talk about at all, but he's obviously the senator from South Carolina who Nikki Haley appointed to the seat. And anyways, this is just a pretty good clip about how dominant Donald Trump is in this party.
Did you ever think that she actually appointed you, Tim? And think of it, appointed, and you're the senator of his state, and she endorsed me. You must really hate her. No, it's a shame. It's a shame. Uh-oh.
I just love you.
No, that's why he's a great politician.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Wow, just throws him on the bus at the end. That's
A
great.
little bit, yeah. I'll cut that out.
Yeah, I mean,
really good.
I was just going to say very quickly, despite the fact that she said all this terrible stuff about Trump, I don't think that really matters to whether she would serve under him or not. Because she did the same thing in 2016. She spent, a year talking about how horrible and terrible Trump was. And then in the end, she endorsed him and voted for him and took a job as administration. So.
No, exactly. Well, friend, really do appreciate you joining us as always. We'll have links below for people to follow your work. People should always be reading Branko's pieces in Jacobin. They are must reads. Is there anything that you'd like our listeners to know about or check out soon?
No, not really. I wish I did, but I spent a long time on this Nikki Haley thing, and now I'm just not doing 9,000 word long pieces. But yeah, I mean, please subscribe to Jacobin, read our pieces. I think it's always good for some political education and to get a little alternative interpretation analysis of what's going on in this country.
Yeah, I just got mine too.
Brand new copy in the mail.
It's a good one. I do have a piece in that, so maybe that's the one I should plug. I have a piece about Andrew. The latest Peter Thiel, horrible Peter Thiel spin-off company.
Oh God!
In this case, to do with AI and war. So that's an exciting front that we're all going to be moving into collectively as a society.
That's exciting. That is very exciting.
Thank you very much for ending on a positive note, friend. Always appreciate having you on the show. We should do it again soon sometime.
For sure. Good to see you guys.
Yeah, good to talk to Branko. His premonition about possibly, and I watching Trumpers talk on like Dave Rubin's show or Tim Pool's show, they hate Nikki Haley. So it would be very interesting if she was chosen for vice president. given that she is sort of like Kamala in that she's a woman that the donor class loves, but like, does anybody else really, like, even her home state?
I mean, we'll be watching that. That just like the thing, because here's the thing about like politics like that is that when you run for president, at least it's like you go, you do it, helps you sell a couple books, and maybe it gets you like a think tank job for a couple years, but you just get to go home. Nothing worse than like having your crescendo of your political career be just getting trounced in your home state.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens with her. But folks, I think we're going to jump over to our other conversation this evening. We got a special twofer. Usually we just do one. But we have a conversation here with Ben Fong, who is a really great academic and writer. Really, really excited to be sharing this conversation with y'all. I'm hoping that this is the correct one. Here, Matt, is this the right one?
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm pretty sure it is. Yep, Fong edit. Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much. So we're going to be talking about the CIO, which is a really radical moment in American labor history. I think really important reference point because as Benjamin says during the interview, if you want to look for a model of how to organize a bunch of people when a lot of people are not organized, not members of the union, there's probably no better example of that in American history, at least, than the CIO. So definitely enjoyed this interview and also check out the podcast. And Matt and I will be right back after that. All right, welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here. Honored to be joined, as always, by Benjamin Fong. Benjamin is the Associate Director of the Center for Work and Democracy at Arizona State University, the author of the great book, Quick Fixes, which we did an interview about a few months back. Y'all should check out. Who also works at Damage Magazine, which is a publication y'all should be reading. There's links below to find all that stuff. Well, we're talking about a new project, friend. We're talking about the podcast Organize The Unorganized, which is out at Jacobin Radio. First off, thank you so much for joining us on Left Reckoning.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
I got to tell you, this podcast, I've really been enjoying listening to the first few episodes that have been out. And, I think it's really timely for a lot of reasons. But instead of me front loading it, I want to ask you, what made you decide to cover in depth the CIO and maybe not just the labor movement in the early 20th century at large? What is it specific about the CIO that's particularly interesting to you today?
Yeah, I think it's if we're looking to get millions of people into the labor movement, there's kind of one time to look to, right? You can make arguments for different moments of labor upsurge in American history. There was the great sort of dramatic rise of the Knights of Labor in the late 19th century. There was a lot of great organizing by the AFL around the turn of the century, sort of the 1900s. There's the great upsurge of 1919, public sector unionism wave of the 60s and 70s, right? You get all these like punctuated moments of labor upsurge in America. But there's really no comparison to the CIO moment, right? It's the one time where the working class won very definitively in American history. It's a time when millions of people not only joined the labor movement, but stayed in the labor movement. And I think that in a lot of ways, it laid the groundwork for post-war prosperity in a way that wasn't the case before and hasn't been replicated since. And so the kinds of things that the CIO did to make that happen, I think sometimes we don't fully appreciate. We look back to the 1930s and say, oh, it's completely different political economic conditions. What are we to learn from this great upsurge? Well, they did a lot of things right that it's worth appreciating. And part of what I want to do in the podcast is to, get to those differences, how some of the lessons are not directly applicable to the present, but many are. And through a lot of interviews with labor historians, I try to draw out some of what those lessons are.
Yeah, I mean, again, people should definitely be taking a deep dive into the podcast because I think it does a really good job at breaking these things down. And I do agree. I mean, I think, the CIO, like sometimes, leftists get very depressed and understandably so. Things are really rough. But friend, if you look back at the early 20th century too, like things look really bleak as well. And maybe to sort of start us off, helping people understand the differences here, it's a kind of basic question about like the AFL versus the CIO, because I think a lot of people don't understand. They know that these are two different organizations, but maybe don't understand the differences here, and specifically, the differences between like craft and industrial unionism. And I just have to say, and tell me if I'm off base here, but one thing that's really striking about thinking about craft versus industrial unionism is that, a lot of times in the US today, when you see these expansions of unions or attempts to unionize certain industries, people say like something along the lines of like, oh, well, coal mine, unions are for coal miners or for basically like the most exploited workers. But there was a period of time in American history where unions were very much people who were, the higher rate wage earners, the people who were the skilled workers. I mean, could you talk a little bit about that dynamic here?
Yeah, great. If anything, it was the opposite perception, right? For a really long time, 50 plus years, unskilled workers looked at unions and thought of as a kind of labor aristocracy, that they thought that they were uninterested in a lot of workers. So the American Federation of Labor, I think it was founded in 1886. And since that period, it was really the dominant labor federation in the United States. Again, there had been other forms of labor upsurge, dramatic strikes that the AFL was sometimes not that involved in or an active hamper on. But it maintained a degree of influence and great power amongst certain strata of workers for a really long time, basically until the 1930s. The AFL was the dominant labor federation. And it drew its power from the skill of the workers that it organized. The basic idea being that if you're going to have power in the labor market, you need to occupy certain places within it where you have irreplaceable skills. And by having those skills, you can exercise a degree of leverage over employers, typically on a sort of industry-wide basis, right? The idea was that you could develop certain contracts wherein you'd get itinerant workers coming to town and they'd be covered under the contract when they came if they had that particular set of skills. This was a very useful paradigm, actually, for a long time. Before you got the development of mass production industries, it was a source of power. It still is today, by the way. Some of the most powerful unions in the country are craft unions, right? Nurses, for instance. Nurses are oftentimes hived off from the rest of hospital workers because they have a particular set of skills that can be leveraged to great power. And so the craft model hasn't gone away, but it really was the dominant one for a long time because it did offer the workers that it organized some degree of leverage. It was a successful model. That being said, it was highly exclusionary. It oftentimes was explicitly anti-immigrant, explicitly racist in some of its practices. It was an organization that was seen to the sort of broad working classes as somewhat hostile to their interests, and this is actually a impression of unionism that the CIO had to overcome when it organized the mass industries, like overcoming this idea that unions are out to exclude large segments of the working class. So the CIO comes along in the 30s, or the sort of key leaders, John L. Lewis, Sidney Hillman, David Dubinsky, they come along and say, look, our political economic situation is completely different. We've got these large industries with these large factories that we need to organize. And we've got a political environment that is actually quite receptive to industrial unionism for the first time. With FDR and the New Deal, they saw this as the moment to strike. And they did finally in 1935 in forming the CIO.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a really helpful breakdown. And I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about, a figure like John L. Lewis for people who are less familiar, because, this is somebody who sort of has, I don't know, depending on who you ask and when you asked, a few different perceptions. There's many perceptions of this character.
I personally would not have wanted to deal with Lewis. He seemed like absolutely impossible. But in the 1920s, he was known as an autocrat, very dictatorial in his union. He oversaw a declining union in that decade, the 1920s, and was criticized from all sides, was challenged within the UMWA, but he retained his power. And with the Great Depression, the miners' union kind of collapsed, like a lot of unions. Then in 1933, with the National Industrial Recovery Act, he saw an opportunity. He had been pushing for the inclusion of Section 7A into that act, which guaranteed formally, at least, the right of workers to organize unions of their own choosing. And it was with the inspiration of the NIRA and going out into the coal fields and saying the president wants you to join a union, that Lewis was able to negotiate the bituminous coal code of 1933, which was an industry-wide contract that they had been seeking basically since their founding in 1890. And it was a huge victory, right? It transformed the UMWA. All of a sudden, they're a powerful union again. They've got 600,000 members. They've got a huge treasury. And Lewis looks around him and to other union leaders, and he says, you all got to do the same thing, right? Now is the moment. Now is the moment we've been looking for. And they didn't, for various reasons that I've covered, right? Various jurisdictional issues, not thinking that organizing the unskilled masses was going to be worth it in the long run. But Lewis had that vision. You could say that the one thing that he was interested in throughout his life was power. And in the 1920s, he oversaw a shrinking industry, a dying industry in some sense, with anthracite coal. And then in the 1930s, he saw the opportunity to exercise power in a new way, and a way that benefited the working class. And so he did.
So, it's interesting. So I just did a review for Jacobin on a book about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And they associated briefly with the CIO. But one of the problems there was that, at least with them and their relationship with the CIO, was the role of communists in and around the CIO, which again is like one of those things where there's a kind of mixed history. Could you talk a little bit about like the role of maybe communists within the CIO, and maybe more broadly, socialists in general? People might call themselves democratic socialists, or we might consider to be democratic socialists today.
Yeah, I think that it's undeniable that the CIO succeeded because it was able to benefit from the great commitment, energy, experience, enthusiasm of the left, particularly as it existed in the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. The communist approach to trade unions had gone through a few iterations by this point. So, they had gone back and forth between wanting to form independent, radical, wall-to-wall kind of unions. They had gone back and forth between that and what was called at a certain point boring from within. Right? The idea was that they would go within AFL unions and work from the inside to transform existing union infrastructure. And they had gone back and forth for a while, but then when the CIO came along, they fully committed to it. And in fact, some radical historians have said they committed too much to it, right? That they should have maintained some of their independence from the CIO, because at the end of the day, they were sent out into the field as cannon fodder for Lewis, who always understood that he was going to control them in the end. But in the early period, the sort of ascendant period of the CIO, roughly 1935 to 1941, I mean, we could argue about the dates, but in that early period, the role of communist organizers was remarkably salutary. I mean, they were some of the best organizers. They were the most energetic. They were willing to risk the most as well. And so in the Steelworkers campaign, for instance, right, the Steelworkers campaign started with a huge gift from the mine workers of something like $500,000. They hired something like 200 organizers right off the bat. And it's estimated that, somewhere between 60 and 80 of those organizers were members of the Communist Party. So right off the bat, at the get-go with a lot of these organizing committees and unions, the communists were very influential, right? I mean, 1937, Flint doesn't happen probably without the Communist Party. As you say, though, the influence is mixed. Communists were in charge of some unions, so it's largely agreed that UE, Packing House, the Longshore Union, certain unions, communists were either in positions of power or they had some degree of influence with the leaders of those unions. And they oftentimes engaged in kinds of manipulation of procedure in such a way that appeared to the rank and file to be duplicitous in some sense, right? They were very good at dealing with convention procedures and whatnot in order to get their way, right? They were committed, right? And so they thought that it was worth it, but that resulted in a lot of suspicion from the rank and file. They also change positions sometimes too, right? I mean, when the books opened up, it was revealed that lo and behold, some were indeed taking orders from Moscow, as the Red Baiters had accused them of. And so, some workers in CIO unions, organizers in CIO unions, were confused, were genuinely confused when they changed positions on certain things or held fast to certain things that were pretty out of line with what rank and file workers wanted. So, ideologically, there's a mixed history there, but certainly from the beginning, as far as their organizing commitment goes, the CIO doesn't happen without the community.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely critical to note. It's just it's interesting to see what happens in some of those specific incidents, but that's for another time, I think. I was curious, like, if you could talk a little bit about, some of the major kind of victories. I mean, you sort of outlined this a little bit at the beginning, but some of these major victories that the CIO was able to win. Maybe we can start first, like, on the sense of, like, on the economic side, on the shop floor, and then maybe talk a little bit later about the political side.
Yeah, sure. So the CIO was founded in November 1935 at the AFL convention that year. It is storied that John L. Lewis had jumped over a row of chairs in order to punch the Carpenters president, William Hutchison, in the face. He was irritated by the AFL's continued resistance to industrial unionism, and he said, finally, that's it, right? And it's sort of symbolized in that punch. They opened their first office a month later in DC, and right off the bat, they knew that they had to take advantage of developing situations in rubber and auto. I think it's fair to say that the CIO that its initial mission was to organize steel. For various reasons, Lewis wanted to organize the steel companies. The big problem in the coal mining industry was what was called captive mines that specifically were only produced for certain companies or were owned directly by those companies. So, and in those cases, the coal miners couldn't get into those particular mines because the union couldn't get in because it was owned by different companies, by the steel companies. So Lewis said, if we're going to have 100% organization in coal, you need to organize steel. So right off the bat, the CIO said, okay, this is going to be our goal. But the rank and file agitation at the time, it was in rubber and auto. And so right off the bat, they send organizers to Akron, Ohio, to where there's this huge strike at the Goodyear complex in Akron. And they also send organizers to Michigan, to Detroit and Flint and other places where it's clear that the auto workers are also agitating. It would be an over-exaggeration to say that the CIO, won those victories, like the win over Goodyear in Akron in early 1936. It's often called the first CIO strike, but activity was happening before the CIO got on the scene. But they were able to exercise a salutary role. Some of the key organizers of the CIO helped with communications. Some of them helped with negotiations with local police and the sort of municipal government. They were dealing with negotiations and at the table in such a way that brought experience from previous organizing drives to workers that were militant and ready for a union, but not necessarily experienced in the way they were. And so you could say that they were sort of an older generation bringing some experience to a new wave of militancy. And they won at Goodyear. I mean, it wasn't a huge win. Basically, the company comes along and says, we'll recognize you. I mean, but that's all it took to declare a win in those days, right? These were industries that had been used to being anti-union for so long, and that a company like Goodyear would come along and recognize the union. It was a huge win, and obviously it conferred legitimacy on the union in such a way that they could go to other places and say, hey, we won here. We won over Goodyear. We got Goodyear to come to the table. We can do the same for you. In late 1936, workers go out at the Flint GM complex, and this results in a 44-day sit-down strike, probably the most iconic strike of the period. It was a tremendously strategic initiative. They knew what they were doing. They worked to seize the most economically important plant at GM. which is Chevy plant number 4, where the motors were made. So they had a very strategic understanding of the operations and knew the choke points in the production process. And once they seized that, GM came to the table, right? That was really a turning point. One key factor here, of course, was that Michigan had elected this guy named Frank Murphy, who was governor, and Murphy refused to send in the National Guard. So the combination of this great militancy, occupying the factories, knowing which buildings to occupy, in combination with the fact that you've got this somewhat friendly, or at least not hostile, administration in power, led to the victory over General Motors. And if the victory in Goodyear was stunning, the victory over GM was huge. I mean, General Motors, it was the corporation at the time. If you wanted to have a successful corporation, you want to go to business school, you studied GM because it was the model of success. And for GM to come to the table, that really opened up the floodgates. And so after Flint, you saw U.S. Steel finally agree to organize the U.S. Steel workforce with the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. And you got this wave of sit-down militancy all around the country, to a lot of different industries, like elevator operators having sit-down strikes between floors, like stuff like that. It really became a widespread anti-capitalist, you could say, phenomenon in the 1937, and it scared a lot of people.
Well, I was just going to say, like, in terms of scaring a lot of people, a lot of the tactics and strategies that the CIO is pushing then, have now been sort of made illegal or limited significantly since, because they were so effective. In the last couple of minutes, and again, people should really be listening to this to the podcast, because there's so many really great historians on there, and actually maybe that's where we should leave it. If you wanted to maybe give people a little bit of a tease, some of, a lot of our listeners are pretty well read when it comes to labor history. So if you want to name some names of some of the people who contributed, to put together this program, those voices are absolutely incredible.
Yeah, thanks. I was very lucky. If you listen to the podcast, you will mercifully not have to hear me speaking the whole time. I narrate the podcast and try to tie it together cohesively, but it mostly consists of interviews with labor historians and experts, also archival clips, songs interspersed throughout. And, some of the people I talked to, David Brody, Melvin Dubofsky, Elizabeth Cohen, Nelson Lichtenstein, Steve Frazier, Jeremy Brecker, I was, again, extremely lucky in who I got to talk to. Basically, whoever I sought, I sort of got interviews with, very thankfully. And, it's mostly labor historians recounting the story of the CIO. I got to say, I was especially excited to get Melvin Dubofsky and David Brody, who are, key progenitors of what's called the new labor history. They are, I think, 89 and 93, respectively. And I mean, remarkably sharp. I mean, if I'm half of that sharp at that age, I will be very, very lucky. I mean, they have forgotten more labor history than I'll ever know. They're two of the narrators on the podcast. And I think it's a real treat to get their different perspectives on what worked, what didn't, why it worked at a particular time, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And where can people find it?
So it's on Jacobin Radio, if you're subscribed to that RSS feed. And it's also at soundcloud.com/Organize The Unorganized.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Left Reckoning. And again, we'll have links below for people to check out the podcast and other places where you can find Ben's work. Always a pleasure to speak with you, friend. So
cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Yes, friends. Really, always great talking to Benjamin. And this podcast is really phenomenal. I really can't suggest it enough. I've been enjoying taking this deep dive into the CIO.
Yeah, it sounds interesting. And that is Jacobin Radio, not behind a paywall either. That's a public podcast, correct?
It's for the people. Yeah.
There you go.
Just, and since we're plugging and things like that too, another thing that Benjamin and other good friends of ours are involved with Damage Magazine, which has their first print issue out now. And I know I have pushed it to folks many times. One, Damage Magazine, the website is great, but this print publication is phenomenal. It's got a lot of guests of the program and also people who we would really like to be speaking to sometime soon. So you can get that damagemag.com. I think it's a really important addition to the left media sphere. Some really great pieces in there. So a lot of great stuff to check out. There's links below for people to find all that, along with Branko's work, Benjamin's first book, not first book, but Benjamin's book, Quick Fixes, which is a really great book as well. We interviewed him a while back. A lot of fun things if you just go down and check out the show notes. There's all sorts of things you can find, including patreon.com/leftreckoning, where you can get access to the post game where Matt and I have a lot of fun stuff for y'all. We're going to be doing something that y'all, backed by popular demand, we're going to be taking a little bit of a swim, a little bit of a dive, we would say, into David Pakman. Maybe not so much Israel-Palestine this time, but he has some pretty interesting thoughts about the state of the left, which, I don't know, maybe should be included in the conversation. So we'll have that in the post-game.
Yeah, hasn't talked about Israel-Palestine since he decided he needed to call on Rashida Tlaib to apologize for the audacity of suggesting Israel might target a hospital.
Well, he does talk about it a little bit. No, you're right in the sense, as far as I know, in terms of videos, but he does mention it a lot as like an aside, right? Which is even more cowardly in a way than not talking. Oh, he'll be like, oh, well, there's certain kinds of progressives who, if you don't hate Israel enough, you're not a real progressive, right? That's the kind of line that we're getting.
Oh, no, that's me. Yeah, I agree with that.
I think that's very fair.
I think, I hear about like, this is what the left is saying within Israel. It's like, are they anti-Zionist or are they pro-Zionist? Because to be honest, like the most leftist, progressive Zionist, I'm not really interested right now in hearing from.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. So we'll have more of that, folks, in the post-game, patreon.com/leftreckoning to get access to it. Please come over there, support the program, and hang out with us for a little bit. So we'll be over there about 10:15.
Yeah, and actually, on the same topic, we'll be playing some CNN footage of Israel doing a genocidal practice known to people in the academic literature, but also like imagine the cemeteries in your community were bulldozed. How would you feel about it? Probably not great. I'm going to talk about how I am worried that the longer this goes on, the more people on the left we're going to see sympathize with terrorists. And with terrorists, I mean the IDF. So check that out, patreon.com/leftreckoning.
All right, folks, come see us there. Have a good week.